The year is 48 CE. A 15-year-old girl steps into the grand halls of the Palatine Palace. Her white silk dress clings to her form, and a crown of myrtle leaves rests on her golden hair. The Senate rises in her honor. The crowd roars with approval. Emperor Claudius, now 50, his limp ever present, takes her small hand in his. His name is legendary. Hers will become something far darker. Valeria Messalina. Remember it. Rome did everything it could to forget. They expect her to save them. The blood stains from Caligula's assassination are still fresh on the palace floors. For years of madness, executions for sport, incest paraded as policy. A reign so twisted that even his gods had to cut him down in a tunnel beneath the palace. Rome needs stability, heirs, virtue. They dress her as their salvation. Within 10 years, Messalina will transform the palace into something that even ancient sources can hardly describe without fear. Senators will become her prisoners. Aristocratic daughters will vanish into her chambers, only to return broken and bound by secrets they will carry to their graves. She will orchestrate contests that would shame even the most experienced courtesans. She will pull off blackmail so sophisticated that modern intelligence agencies would pause in awe. She will marry another man while still being Empress, in daylight, with witnesses, daring Rome to stop her. And when they do, her statues will be dragged through the streets, shattered. Her name will be erased from every inscription. Official records will be rewritten as if she never existed. Damnatiomemoriae. The damnation of memory. 2,000 years later, you're still here, still listening. Because the stories that Rome tried hardest to bury are the ones that refuse to stay buried. So what happens when corruption is no longer just a symptom of power, but power itself? Around 38 CE. The Forum is alive with voices, merchants haggling over silk, senators arguing about grain, children running between columns. Rome looks invincible, but the rot has already set in. Tiberius died 2 years ago, hated and paranoid, exiled to Capri. Then came Caligula. 4 years of madness, executions as entertainment. A horse made a senator, and men forced to watch as Caligula violated their wives at dinner. When the Praetorian Guard finally moved on January 24th, 41 CE, 29 stab wounds ended his reign. His wife dead beside him, his infant daughter's skull crushed. Rome exhaled, then panicked. Who would come next? They find him hiding behind a curtain. Claudius, the stammering uncle. The family embarrassment. The man with the limp and drool. 50 years old. Never wanted power. Never expected it. The god proclaims him emperor, not because he's qualified, but because he's alive and Rome needs someone with the purple before the city tears itself apart. Claudius knows he's just a placeholder. He needs legitimacy fast, an heir, a dynasty, proof the gods haven't abandoned Rome. So he marries Valeria Messalina, his 15-year old third cousin. A bloodline tracing back to Augustus himself. Her beauty is enough to inspire poetry. Pale skin, golden hair, and features so perfect they seem carved by the gods. She's been groomed for this. Educated in virtue, taught to lower her eyes and speaks awfully, embodying the chastity that holds Roman civilization together. On paper, she's perfect. The Senate approves. The people cheer. Rome has a future again. But here's the question nobody asked: what happens when you take a child and dress her as a goddess? What happens when you place her in a palace where every door opens at her command, where senators bow, where her husband, twice her age, is terrified of losing power? What happens when you tell her that her entire value lies in her womb and her purity, that she must be modest, obedient, chaste, living as a symbol of virtue? When you hand unlimited power to someone whose only instruction is not to use it? What happens when the gap between what she's forced to be in public and what she desires in private becomes a chasm? Rome is about to find out. Messalina's first 2 years are perfect by Roman standards. She gives Claudius a daughter, Claudia Octavia, and later a son, Britannicus. The Senate breathes easier. The empire has heirs. She appears at state functions draped in modest attire, head covered, eyes downcast. Every gesture is choreographed to embody virtue, the perfect Roman matron. In public, she's everything Rome demands. But behind the scenes, Rome has always divided its women into two categories: the matronae, the wife, and the mere tricks, the court saint. One lives in the atrium, raises children, guards family honor. The other lives in the lupanar, the brothel, where men shed their civilized clothes. The system works because these categories never touch. Messalina decides to be both. The first whisper begins in 40 CE. A senator returns late from Ostia. Business ran low. He decides to visit the Sabura, Rome's red-light district. Narrow streets, the smell of cheap wine and piss, cramped in Seoul where oil lamps burn low. There in the darkness he chooses a room and pays his coin. A woman enters. Dark wig, eyes smudged with heavy coal, myrrh and roses trying to mask the expensive perfume. She turns toward him. Their eyes meet. It's her, the Empress of Rome. According to Tacitus, yes, decades later and with his own agenda, but with access to palace insiders, this was a mistake. Messalina, under the name Lysa, becomes a regular at the brothel, not out of necessity, but for the thrill. Every client who doesn't recognize her is an unwitting accomplice. Every man who does becomes someone she owns, because who will he report her to? She's not just breaking the rules, she's weaponizing the hypocrisy that built them. Because in Rome, senators kept mistresses, generals visited brothels, married men slept with slaves and nobody blinked. But women, especially aristocratic women, were supposed to be above desire. Marble statues, vessels for breeding, symbols of virtue. Messalina looks at that cage and walks out the door. She returns before dawn, removes the wig, washes the cheap perfume away, dresses in imperial silk, and attends the morning sacrifice to Vesta, goddess of chastity, with the same serene expression she wore the night before, as if nothing happened. But the brothel was just a laboratory. The real operation happens inside the palace. Picture the banquets. Rome's elite sprawled on silk couches around low tables. Roasted dormice glazed with honey. Wine flowing from jeweled cups. Senators making small talk. Generals discussing Britain. Very Roman. Very civilized. Then Messalina gives the signal. The servants leave. The doors close. New guests arrive, gladiators, still smelling of the arena. Actors from the theater. For uncaptives. Sometimes the teenage sons of patrician families, summoned under the pretense of discussing their father's careers. What happens next is described with horror and fascination. Forced performances, humiliating contests, senators paired with their political enemies, told to entertain the Empress. Aristocratic women, married, respectable, terrified, coerced into playing the prostitute while their husbands watch from across the room, frozen. Refuse a listen option. A tribune declines her invitation 3 days later. HES floating in the Tiber. A nobleman tries to leave early, his family loses their estate by week's end. The message is clear: Messalina does not accept no. Then comes the contest. A competition between Messalina and a famous prostitute named Scylla. Not for money, for pride. Who could outlast more partners in a single night? 25th Messalina wins. Pliny the Elder writes it down, clinical and horrified. True. Or exaggerated. We'll never know. But the story survives because it captured something Romans called and articulate: a woman wielding sexual power, not as submission but as dominance. Rome didn't have language for that. So, they turned it into myth. But myths don't come from nowhere. They reflect something that happened. Something people witnessed in Caligula and forget even when they tried. The palace becomes a theater of power, where humiliation is currency. Senators arrive at dawn to beg favors and leave at midnight, having performed acts they'll never speak of again. Aristocratic families send their daughters into the Empress's chambers and pray they return unmarried. Most do. Some don't. Nobody asks questions. By now, everyone understands the system. Messalina doesn't just wield power. She collects it, person by person, building a network of complicity so vast that nobody can move against her without destroying themselves. Every participant becomes a prisoner. Every witness an accomplice. She doesn't need the Senate's approval. She has their shame. And that's better than loyalty. Loyalty can shift. Shame lasts forever. Through it all, Claudius works, expanding the empire into Britain, building aqueducts, reforming the courts. The competent emperor everyone underestimated. Does he know? Of course he knows. Rome is gossiping. Senators whispering. His own freedmen begging him to act. But what can he do? She's the mother of his heirs. Moving against her means admitting he's been cuckolded before the entire empire. It means civil war. So he does what powerful men have done throughout history when faced with unbearable truth. He looks away, works harder, pretends the rot isn't spreading. But in 48 CE, it finally ends. It's autumn. Claudius is in Ostia overseeing the grain supply. Rome survives on Egyptian wheat. Disruption means riots. HES doing his job being the competent administrator Rome needs. Meanwhile, Messalina is getting married again to Gaius Silius, a powerful senator. Young, handsome, ambitious. Everything Claudius isn't. But here's the detail that shatters everything she doesn't hide it. This isn't a secret affair. This is a public wedding ceremony. With witnesses. With contracts. With formal vows. All while still married to the emperor. Ancient sources describe the disbelief. The frozen moment when Rome's elite watched the empress take another husband in broad daylight, as if the rules simply didn't apply to her anymore. Was it a power play? A coup attempt? Did Messalina think Claudius was too weak to respond? Or had she reached the point where transgression itself was the goal? What we do know is that her actions finally push Rome's limits. Narcissus, Claudius' most trusted freedman, hears the news first. He rushes to Ostia and finds the emperor reviewing grain ledgers. Picture that conversation. How do you tell an emperor that his wife just married someone else? Claudius returns to Rome, backed by the Praetorian Guard. They find Messalina in the gardens of Lucullus, where she's with her mother, Lepida. The older woman is begging her daughter to act, to run, to do something. But Messalina seems frozen. Some sources say she tries to write a petition for mercy. Others say she just stands there, unable to believe its ending. After 10 years of bending Rome to her will, Rome has finally bent back. The soldiers arrive. She drops to her knees, begs, pleads, offers her children. The soldiers don't respond. Orders are orders. She reaches for a dagger, maybe her mother's. Her hand shakes. She presses the blade to her own throat. But she can't do it. A tribune steps forward. His name is forgotten, but his action is recorded. He drives the blade home. Messalina dies at 25th, in a pool of blood on the grass where she once held power. Claudius orders damnatiomemoriae. Her statues are dragged through the streets and shattered. Her name is erased. Her story rewritten as if she never existed. But Rome doesn't forget. And 2,000 years later we're still talking about her. Messalina's's story isn't just about scandal. It's about what happens when power becomes a game. When shame becomes currency. When the people meant to lead an empire are to compromise to stop its decay. As Rome attempted to silence Messalina, it did so through force and manipulation. The damnatiomemoriae, it was the final weapon in a battle the empire called and win. Her statues were torn down, her name erased from inscriptions, and the very idea of her existence scrubbed from history. But in the rubble of this era sewer, something else emerged, an enduring myth. One that had been carefully constructed by those who lived in fear of her. It was just her peers who felt the weight of Messalina's actions, but the very structure of Roman power itself. The elites of Rome, those who had once reveled in the luxuries and privileges of imperial favor, now lived in the shadow of her memory. Messalina had shown them the deepest of Roman fears, a woman who controlled through sex, through humiliation, and through the weaponization of shame. A woman who, despite her position, had no compunction about exploiting the hypocrisy of a system that was supposed to elevate her as virtuous and pure. What Rome feared most about Messalina was just her political machinations, or the destruction she caused in her personal life. It was that she had blurred the lines between the sacred and the profane. Messalina, by wielding the very forces that were meant to subjugate women, made them part of her arsenal. Senators, generals, even the emperor himself had become unwilling participants in her game, bound not by loyalty, but by their own deepest, darkest secrets. And it was just her personal escapades that left a mark. It was her uncanny ability to manipulate the narrative of Rome. For the Romans, their power was built on reputation. For a leader, honor was everything. Messalina tore that apart with each act of defiance, exposing the chasm between the image of Roman virtue and the reality of its corruption. As much as the empire tried to erase her from the annals of history, her actions, her power would not stay buried. The collective consciousness of Rome could never entirely escape the idea of a woman who had forced the elite into compliance, who had shaped the very structure of imperial power through sexual politics. And while she may have fallen from grace, her story, the scandal, the manipulation, the destruction of those around her continued to linger, slowly etching itself into the culture that sought to forget her. The empire's method of removing Messalina from the historical record was not just a political act. It was a cultural one. The damnatiomemoriae was a decree of invisibility, an attempt to erase all traces of her from the collective Roman psyche. Yet, in doing so, they inadvertently immortalized her. Rome was simply trying to suppress the memory of a dangerous woman. They were trying to suppress the very truths she represented, the fragility of their power. Rome, a civilization built on the dominance of men, could not tolerate a woman who had used the very weapons of their patriarchal system to bend it to her will. Messalina had done what no one thought possible. She had wielded power without shame, using her sexuality, her beauty, and her cunning to outmaneuver even the most powerful men in the empire. In the centuries that followed, the myth of Messalina only grew. The stories of her licenses, her control over the empire, and the fears she inspired were retold, embellished, and immortalized in the tales of the Romans who survived her reign. But in every retelling, the truth became more obscure, twisted into the shape of the empire's fear. Messalina was painted as the ultimate villainess, a woman whose ambitions went too far, whose desires knew no bounds, whose transgressions reached the very core of Rome's morality. Yet, in these versions of her story, something remained. The memory of Messalina lingered, like the ghost of an empire's shame. She was gone, but the lessons she taught would not be forgotten. The elite who had once been her puppets, her unwilling accomplices, passed their secrets down through generations, and the whispers of Messalina's's power continued to echo through the marble halls of power. Even in modern times, the remnants of Messalina's's legacy can be found in the stories of other powerful women who rose to influence and then fell from grace. The fear of a woman who controls not just with strength, but with knowledge of the deepest desires of the men around her, still lingers in our cultural psyche. It's a fear that stretches beyond Rome, beyond the ancient world, and finds its way into the modern narratives of power, corruption, and secrecy. Messalina's name, erased from the official records, lives on in the hushed tones of those who dare to ask what does it mean to wield power as a woman in a world that seeks to suppress your very existence. What happens when the empire is as much built on the hypocrisy of its own morality as it is on the strength of its leaders? The story of Messalina, though buried, is far from over. She may have been erased from the official histories, but the lessons of her rise and fall continue to resonate. They serve as a reminder that history's most dangerous stories are often the ones that remain hidden in the shadows, just beyond the reach of power's control. Because when the past cannot be erased, it transforms into something far more dangerous: an idea, a legend, a truth that cannot be forgotten. And so, we continue to dig through the layers of history, piecing together the fragments that the Romans tried to bury. Messalina's tale is a warning. It is a story not just of a woman, but of an empire's fragility, its internal decay, and the terrifying reality of unchecked power. In the end, Messalina didn't just break the rules, she proved that power itself could be corrupted from the inside out. And the empire that created her, with its myths and contradictions, could never erase the truth of what she had done. Despite her death, Messalina's's shadow continued to stretch across the Roman Empire. After her fall, the empire had to reckon with what she had revealed. She had exposed the ugly truth that beneath the surface of Rome's outward appearance of virtue and piety, there was a rotting core, one that thrived on corruption, hypocrisy, and abuse of power. The political and moral fabric of the empire had been manipulated by Messalina in ways that no one had dared to admit before. Even in her destruction, she revealed a deeper crisis, one that would echo for centuries. After Messalina's's death, the Senate did not immediately return to its former reverence for emperors. Instead, the empire began to fall into a quiet disarray, exacerbated by the nature of the new leadership under Claudius's successor Nero. Nero, Messalina's son minus law and step minus son, was born into a world of excess and manipulation. Under his rule, Rome's rot only deepened, proving that Messalina's's power had been merely a symptom of a far greater disease. Where Messalina had wielded control through sexual power and blackmail, Nero would wield control with cruelty, excess, and ultimately madness. But the methods differed, and the consequences were different. Nero would engage in violent public spectacles, orchestrating the deaths of those who threatened his rule, all the while indulging in a hedonistic lifestyle that Messalina had merely hinted at. The empire, now fully entrenched in its contradictions, was coming apart at the seams, unable to sustain the myths of purity it had once so proudly broadcast. Yet, even as the empire crumbled under these new, chaotic emperors, Messalina's legacy lived on. Scholars, writers, and even modern historians would return again and again to the lessons hidden in her life. The world of power she had created through manipulation and exploitation would be dissected, feared, and yet, in some ways, admired for its audacity. While some would decry Messalina as a villain, others would view her as a symbol of a woman who understood something vital about the balance of power, a woman who took the tools of her oppression and turned them into weapons that could dismantle an empire. What Messalina truly exposed was the extent to which women in the Roman Empire were trapped by the societal constraints placed upon them. The idealized image of the virtuous matron, submissive to her husband, dedicated to the state, was a facade. Messalina's refusal to conform to it was as much a critique of the system as it was an act of defiance. But it was also a tragic realization that despite her power, her fate was sealed from the moment she stepped into that gilded cage of palace life. In a world where women were seen as nothing more than symbols of virtue, her transgressions, no matter how powerful or revolutionary, were her undoing. Even her most bitter enemies could not help but acknowledge her political genius. Messalina had used her position in the court to build alliances, exact revenge, and manipulate the most powerful men in Rome. She used her sexuality not just to fuel her own desires, but as a tool to gain leverage, control, and to secure her position in a patriarchal society that had given her few options. In the end, however, her rebellion against the roles imposed on her was met with the full force of Roman imperialism. The empire, which had built its strength on the backs of women like Messalina, who were expected to be both mothers and symbols of virtue, was now faced with a terrifying question: what happens when a woman breaks the rules of the game? In Messalina's case, the empire destroyed her. The political machinery, long used to maintaining its authority by silencing dissent, turned on its most prominent female player and erased her from memory. The brutal execution of Messalina was not just a message to her, but a message to all women in Rome: know your place, stay within your prescribed roles, or face annihilation. Yet, as the centuries passed, the memory of Messalina refused to fade. It morphed into a story that continued to captivate, disturb, and intrigue people across time. The suppression of her story became an attempt to control the narrative of female power. As Messalina had shown, even in a world where women were seen as mere commodities, a woman with the right tools and intelligence could seize control. And this terrifying truth made Messalina's's story dangerous to the powers that be. The very attempt to erase her from history only served to magnify her significance, transforming her into a mythic figure whose life and actions would echo through the centuries. Messalina's tale, like so many in history, is a complex and contradictory one. It is a story of power, manipulation, and defiance. But it is also a tragic reminder of the limitations placed on women and how these limitations can shape the very systems they are forced to navigate. In some ways, Messalina's life was a battle not just against the men who ruled Rome, but against the very idea of what a woman could be in Roman society. Her name, erased from official records, still lingers in the whispers of those who have uncovered her story. And perhaps that is the true victory of Messalina, not her manipulation of the empire, but her ability to defy or azure. Her name, though it was intended to disappear, has lived on as a symbol of what happens when the boundaries of power and morality are crossed, and when a woman dares to wield that power without apology. Her name, though wiped from history by the hands of those who feared her influence, continues to reverberate through the centuries. Messalina's story, like many stories that empires try to bury, is a warning and a reminder. A reminder of the dangers of power unchecked, the consequences of hypocrisy, and the lasting impact of a woman who dared to rewrite the rules of the game. In modern times, as we dig deeper into the archives of history, Messalina's shadow looms even larger. While the official records crafted by the Senate and Claudius's successors tried to erase her, new discoveries are slowly revealing more of the truth behind the myth. Archaeological excavations beneath the Palatine Hill, where Messalina's palace once stood, have uncovered remnants of her influence, both tangible and intangible. Unearthed mosaics, remnants of secret chambers, and fragments of personal letters point to the complex web she wove within the heart of the Roman Empire. These artifacts are like pieces of a puzzle, revealing a woman who was not just a scandalous figure, but a strategic mastermind who understood the true nature of power. Her ability to use sex as a tool of control was revolutionary. At a time when women in Rome were confined to the home, their roles rigidly defined by virtue and chastity, Messalina transformed her body into the ultimate weapon. She weaponized desire, coercion, and blackmail to build a network of influence that spanned from the highest echelons of power to the darkest corners of Rome's forbidden districts. In her world, every gesture was a calculated move, every whispered conversation a potential alliance. What we often forget when discussing figures like Messalina is that in her time, the stakes were unimaginably high. Every misstep could lead to execution, betrayal, or ruin. Messalina was not only playing the game, she was rewriting the rules entirely. But Messalina's's downfall also serves as a cautionary tale. The same system that allowed her to rise to the pinnacle of power also ensured her destruction. The very empire that glorified her manipulation and cunning could not tolerate her challenges to its patriarchal order. When she crossed the final line, daring to marry another man in the full public eye while still Empress, Rome's refusal to allow such an affront to its honor and structure sealed her fate. The empire that once cheered her rise now demanded her fall. What does this say about the nature of power? Messalina's's story is a reflection of the precarious balance between control and chaos. Power, when wielded without restraint, becomes a monster that consumes everything in its path. It devours those who seek it, those who hold it, and those who would stand in its way. In Messalina's's case, it ultimately consumed her own legacy. The very force that had catapulted her to the throne turned on her when her ambition, her appetite for power, became too dangerous to unpredictable. The erasure of Messalina from history is a statement in itself. In an empire built on the ideals of virtue, purity, and law, she was the embodiment of everything those ideals sought to suppress. Her story, though dismissed by the powerful, became a symbol of defiance against the rigid structures of society. It's no wonder then that centuries later, her name would refuse to be forgotten. She had shown the empire that power was not just in the hands of those who were born into it, but in those who were willing to break the rules to claim it. While Messalina's life was filled with transgression, intrigue, and scandal, her legacy speaks to something deeper. Her story reveals the fragility of empires, the tension between morality and power, and the consequences of silence in the face of corruption. Her rise and fall show us that, at the heart of every empire, there are forces at play that are more dangerous than the battles fought in the fields or the laws passed in the Senate. The real battles are fought in the hearts of those who hold power and those who seek to take it from them. In many ways, the story of Messalina is not just the story of one woman, but a reflection of how the systems of power continue to operate today. How those in positions of authority still manipulate the boundaries of virtue and vice, using them to maintain their hold over the masses. How those who challenge the status quo, who dare to expose the hypocrisy of those in power, are still silenced, erased, and forgotten. Messalina, however, will never truly be forgotten. The empire may have tried to bury her, but the truth always finds a way to claw its way to the surface. As we continue to peel back the layers of history, we uncover more stories like Messalina's stories of women who defied the expectations placed upon them, used their power in ways that shocked their societies, and left legacies that empires tried to destroy. These stories are not just about scandal or sin. They are about the nature of power, how it is wielded, and how those who seek to control it must ultimately confront the costs of that control. So, the next time you stand before the ruins of the Palatine Hill or gaze at the ruins of an empire, remember Messalina. Remember that she was more than just the empress who dared to break every rule. She was the embodiment of the contradictions within the empire itself. And her legacy continues to challenge us today. In the end, Rome may have torn her statues down, erased her name from its records, but Messalina's story, like the empire she helped shape, will never truly be forgotten. As we reflect on Messalina's life, one of the most striking aspects of her story is how it mirrors the eternal struggle between public persona and private desires, a theme that transcends time and culture. Messalina was both the symbol of Rome's virtues and its vices, a living contradiction. On one hand, she embodied the ideal Roman matron, a virtuous, chaste wife, the mother of heirs who would carry on the imperial legacy. On the other hand, she was a woman who shattered every moral and social norm weaponizing her sexuality to build a network of influence and control. The duality of Messalina's character reveals something essential about the nature of power. The powerful have always known that their image is just as important as their actions. In the grand halls of empires, appearances matter. But for Messalina, appearances weren't just a mask, they were a battlefield. While Rome celebrated her as a virtuous empress, she worked behind the scenes, amassing power through every whispered secret, every night spent manipulating the elite for her own advantage. She knew better than anyone how easily the Roman elite could be made to bend to their own hypocrisy. She used their weaknesses, both moral and physical, as currency, demanding loyalty in the form of secrets kept and favors owed. Messalina's's story teaches us that power is not only about control, but about knowing how to expose and exploit the flaws in the system. She didn't simply break the rules, she revealed that the rules themselves were arbitrary and often hypocritical. In her hands, Roman virtue became a weapon for her own advancement, a tool she could manipulate at will. Every act of transgression she committed was not just a rebellion against Roman norms, but a direct challenge to the empire's entire moral framework. The ultimate tragedy of Messalina, however, is not just her fall from power, but the way history chose to silence her. The erasure of her name, the damnatiomemoriae decreed by Claudius, was not merely a punishment, it was a calculated act of historical control. The empire that had feared her power sought to erase her existence, as if the mere presence of her story threatened the foundations of the empire itself. The destruction of her statues, the removal of her name from public records, were meant to send a clear message: Messalina was never to be spoken of again. Yet, as we've seen throughout history, when an empire tries to erase the truth, it often comes back stronger, more persistent, and more dangerous than ever. Messalina's legacy may have been buried, but it was never forgotten. Her story, like so many others that were meant to be erased, has endured. It has resurfaced in the annals of history, in the writings of those who dared to challenge the official narrative, in the pages of Tacitus, Suetonius, and later historians. Messalina's name continues to haunt the pages of Roman history. The scandal, the manipulations, the cruelty, all of it remains as a testament to a woman who played by different rules, who turned the very structures of power against those who wielded them. In the centuries since Messalina's's death, her story has often been used as a cautionary tale, a symbol of the dangers of unchecked power, of the corrupting influence of sexual desire, and of the price of ambition. Yet, as we look deeper into her life and the forces that shaped her, we begin to see a more complex figure. Messalina was not just a figure of scandal and shame, she was a woman who understood the mechanics of power better than most men in the empire. She was a woman who knew what it meant to be both the object of desire and the one who controlled it. And in the end, she was a woman who played the game so well that even the empire, with all its might and its attempts to erase her, could not completely forget her. There is, however, another lesson to be learned from Messalina's story. A lesson about the fragility of empires and the way they crumble from within. Rome's downfall was not caused by external forces alone. While barbarian invasions, economic collapse, and political infighting all contributed, the moral rot that Messalina exemplified was just as important a factor. The story of Messalina and the way she manipulated the system, turning its own hypocrisy against itself, shows us how corruption can breed from within and how the very institutions that are supposed to uphold society can become the tools of its destruction. It's a haunting reminder that power, when abused, can tear apart even the most seemingly invincible of empires. Messalina's story is not just the tale of a woman who sought to break free of the constraints placed upon her. It is the story of an empire that allowed itself to be eaten from within by its own decadence and moral decay. Today, as we study Messalina's life, we are reminded of the dangers of unchecked power, of the consequences of corruption, and of the ways in which those who rise to power often do so by exploiting the very systems that should hold them accountable. But we are also reminded of something else, that even in an empire as vast and as mighty as Rome, no one, not even the emperor himself, is beyond the reach of those who play the game of power with ruthless precision. Messalina may have been silenced by the empire, but her story, her legacy, and the lessons it teaches will never be fully erased. And as we look at the world today, we can see that the echoes of Messalina's's story are still with us. In the corridors of power, in the games played by the powerful, in the hypocrisy and secrets that are hidden beneath the surface. The story of Messalina is one we must continue to listen to, for if we fail to learn from her rise and fall, we risk repeating the same mistakes, allowing power to once again corrode from within. The enduring legacy of Messalina, though tarnished by centuries of scandal and erasure, is a reflection of how power operates within society, how it can manipulate, coerce, and ultimately destroy those who challenge the status quo. But what makes Messalina's tale so enduring is not just the shocking acts she committed in her pursuit of power, but the quiet, insidious way in which she reshaped Roman society. It wasn't only the violent contests or the strategic blackmail, it was the manipulation of the very essence of Roman virtue and identity. Theodora may have been remembered as the Empress who broke boundaries, but Messalina was the Empress who made the boundaries break. When we examine her life through a modern lens, we see not just a figure who used her sexual appeal to influence men of power, but a woman who skillfully understood the mechanics of societal norms and subverted them. At the core of her strategies was a profound understanding of the one thing Rome feared most: exposure. For Messalina, exposure wasn't just a personal risk, it was a tool. She weaponized the empire's hypocrisy, exploiting its rules and the blind spots of its men. In doing so, she made herself indispensable to the empire while simultaneously being its most dangerous enemy. And yet, how did she manage to achieve this? What was it about Messalina that allowed her to not just survive in a world dominated by men, but thrive within it, all while keeping the political and social machinery of Rome functioning? The answer lies in her cunning use of psychology. By understanding the empire's vulnerabilities and the psychology of the men around her, she effectively controlled her environment. Messalina's's power wasn't merely rooted in sex. It was in her ability to manipulate perceptions and exploit the desires and weaknesses of those around her. She didn't just break men, she made them break themselves. In many ways, the fall of Messalina represents a tragic, but instructive moment in Roman history. Rome was not destroyed by an external force, it was eaten from the inside. The very system that was designed to protect and elevate Roman civilization became the tool of its own collapse. Messalina's rise to power, her ability to manipulate the system, exploit its weaknesses, and build her own shadow empire, was a direct result of the moral decay that had taken hold of the empire. She didn't just embody the moral rot, she fed off it, making it her own. Her relationship with power wasn't merely about gaining control, it was about breaking the very foundations of Roman virtue. She used the very thing that Roman society held sacred, its notions of honor, purity, and chastity, and turned it against them. Messalina didn't just live by a different set of rules, she made the rules irrelevant. And in doing so, she redefined what it meant to wield power. By the time of her death, Messalina had become a symbol of everything Rome feared but couldn't escape. She was the manifestation of an empire in decline, its elites corrupted by luxury and excess, its systems compromised by hypocrisy. The fact that the empire's response to her was to erase her from history speaks volumes about the kind of empire it had become. Rome, the mighty empire that conquered the known world, couldn't tolerate the truth of its own self-destruction. And so they buried Messalina's name and erased her legacy, hoping that by doing so, they could pretend that the rot had never existed. But history has a way of unearthing what was buried, and Messalina's story has survived. Not as a footnote, but as a stark reminder. The narrative of her life, twisted by propaganda, has been passed down through generations, not just as a tale of scandal and debauchery, but as a cautionary story about the corrupting nature of unchecked power. Her rise and fall are intricately tied to the fate of the empire she inhabited, an empire that, like its rulers, could no longer hide its decay beneath the surface. As we look at her story today, we are reminded of the dangers of absolute power and the fragility of the systems that support it. The lessons that Messalina's life imparts are not just historical curiosities, they are warnings about the nature of power, corruption, and the inevitability of decay. In a world where power often becomes a game played by those with the most to lose, Messalina's life teaches us that the greatest threats to society often come from within, not from the enemies at its gates. Her name, erased from history for centuries, is now a symbol of the empire's fall, not from external threats, but from its own internal contradictions. Her story is a mirror reflecting the dangers of living in a society that values appearances over substance, that holds to ideals of virtue and purity while simultaneously embracing the vices that sustain its power. The fall of Messalina is a story of ambition, manipulation, and the breaking of moral codes, but it's also a reflection of the fragility of those codes. In her quest for power, Messalina didn't just seek control, she sought to expose the lies that kept the empire standing. She wasn't just breaking the rules, she was revealing that those rules were made to be broken. And in the end, the empire couldn't handle the truth. As we stand in the remnants of ancient Rome today, with its broken columns and faded mosaics, we are left to ponder the lessons of Messalina's life and death. She may have been erased from the official records, but her story is far from forgotten. It lives on, not just as a tale of scandal, but as a powerful reminder of what happens when the institutions that hold power are allowed to fester in their own decay. And perhaps in some strange way, Messalina's name and legacy have outlived those who tried to bury it. Because while they may have destroyed her statues and rewritten history, they couldn't erase the most powerful weapon of all, the truth. And the truth, as Messalina knew well, has a way of clawing its way back to the surface, no matter how hard we try to bury it. In the end, Messalina's story transcends her scandalous acts. She was just an individual who exploited the system for her own gain. She became a symbol of how the empire's moral and political foundations were already crumbling. In her, we see the embodiment of an empire that had lost its way, corrupted from within, unable to uphold its own lofty ideals while living in the depths of depravity. Messalina's's manipulation of power was a direct challenge to the Roman ideal of control, an ideal that demanded absolute virtue from women, while excess and vice were tolerated, if not celebrated. But Messalina's ability to manipulate not just the men of the court but the very system that governed Roman morality made her an unprecedented figure. Her reign within the palace was just about defying the emperor, her husband. It was about breaking down the very walls of Roman patriarchy. She turned the palace into a space of rebellion, where every transgression became an assertion of dominance. She understood one essential truth that those in power often overlook. Once power has been tasted, it becomes a constant need, an insatiable hunger. Her actions, however shocking, were a form of rebellion against a society that demanded conformity but failed to practice it. She used the very tool that had been used to control women in Roman society, sexuality, and turned it into her weapon, reshaping her role from a symbolic figure into a ruthless force. The Roman elites who had once ruled with an iron fist were caught in her trap, their power not eroded by war or the economy, but by their own shame. What Messalina revealed was the myth of Roman virtue. The empire had prided itself on its strict codes, its preservation of public honor, and the glorification of its women as symbols of chastity. Messalina turned this myth on its head, proving that those who held power could not only violate the system but could thrive within it. She reveled in her power, forcing the elite into complicity, knowing that silence became a form of submission. The emperor's impotence to act against her only reinforced her dominance. It was inevitable that her unchecked power would lead to her downfall. Rome, ever the paradox of moral righteousness and political decay, could not allow such a blatant challenge to its status quo. Her public marriage to Caligula, her second husband, was the final straw. The marriage wasn't a hidden affair, it was an open act of rebellion, a declaration that she held no regard for the power of the emperor or the Senate. It was, in many ways, a dramatic demonstration of what happens when power is unethered from responsibility. When Claudius finally discovered her betrayal, the empire trembled. Messalina's execution was swift, as was the execution of any power structure that threatens the very heart of imperial authority. In her death, Messalina represented everything that Rome feared: a woman who took the empire's vices and turned them into tools of power. Her execution was a reminder that the empire's codes, while corrupt, still held power when they needed to. But it was also a mark of the empire's own failure to protect itself from within. The aftermath of Messalina's death was brutal, as the empire sought to expunge her memory from its history. Damnatiomemoriae was invoked, and her name was wiped from all records. But here's the irony in trying to erase her: Rome showed her place in history. For history, as always, has a way of clinging to the forgotten, and Messalina's name has outlasted the very empire that tried to obliterate it. Her story serves as a stark reminder of the fragility of power and the ease with which it can be subverted. Messalina's's rise and fall show us how unchecked power and hypocrisy can lead not only to scandal, but to the collapse of an entire system. And the more that Rome tried to suppress her story, the more it endured. History is filled with figures who were erased by those in power. But sometimes, as in Messalina's's case, the act of erasure only serves to immortalize them. Her legacy, distorted and twisted by centuries of scandal and propaganda, speaks to a deeper truth: the most dangerous forces in any society are not always external, but the ones that grow from within. Messalina's rise came from the very system that had been built to uphold Roman virtue. She used that system's contradictions and hypocrisy as stepping stones to achieve her power. The tragedy of Messalina's life is that she wasn't just a product of Rome's excess. She became one of its most potent weapons. When we look at the ruins of the Palatine Hill today, we see only fragments of the empire that once ruled the known world. Tourists stroll through the crumbling columns, unaware that beneath their feet lies a history far darker than what's taught in textbooks. Messalina's name is no longer spoken aloud. Her statues lie shattered in the streets, but the lessons of her rise and fall still echo in the halls of power. The truth about Messalina isn't just in the scandalous stories about her sexual escapades, it's in the very way her story exposes the vulnerability of those who hold power. Power, when it is left unchecked, becomes corrupt. Messalina's story is a testament to the fact that all empires, no matter how powerful, will eventually rot from within, even live by their own contradictions and vices. So when we look at her story, let it be a reminder that history has a way of repeating itself. The lessons learned from the fall of Rome, from the manipulation of power that Messalina so skillfully demonstrated, are not lessons confined to the past. They are lessons for today, reminding us that no matter how strong an empire may seem, it is only as strong as the integrity of its leaders and the systems that support them. In the end, no empire can survive without confronting its own decay, just as no leader can survive without understanding the cost of their power.